We're pleased to have you join us for the 4th California Current Acidification Network, or CCAN, Ocean Acidification Roundtable Discussion of 2018. The title of today's presentation is Kelping the Sea, pun intended, Farming Seaweeds for Research and Resources in the Pacific Northwest. This series is hosted by the California Current Acidification Network, and in short, the series is intended to create a direct dialogue among fishing and aquaculture industry members, natural resource managers, and scientists within the California Current ecosystem. With awareness of and access to the research and its applications and uses, the participants will be able to collaborate to better understand and adapt to ocean acidification moving forward. So I'm Meg Chadsey, a Washington Sea Grant colleague of CCAN Steering Committee member Terry King, and I'm excited to be moderating this webinar today because I've been involved in this kelp aquaculture experiment since its inception 5 years ago, when it was just an 800-word entry to Paul Allen Family Foundation's Ocean Challenge to mitigate ocean acidification impacts. I'm also very happy to have last month's featured speaker, Shallon Bush from NOAA, as our behind-the-scenes facilitator. Thank you for your webinar magic, Shallon. During the presentation, attendees will be in listen-only mode. You are welcome to type questions related to technical issues or questions for the presenters in the questions box at the bottom of the control panel on the right of your screen. We will be monitoring incoming questions and will respond to them or pose them to our speaker after each of their presentations. We're also recording this session and will share the recording on the CCAN website. So a little bit about today's format. You'll hear from our first speaker about how this experimental kelp farm in Washington State's Hood Canal came to be, and a little bit about the oceanographic objectives of this project. Then you'll hear from all three speakers in turn about potential commercial kelp aquaculture opportunities that may end up developing from this project. And we have a great group of speakers today, and I'll just introduce all three of them now before turning over the controls. So Joth Davis is a marine scientist who has worked in the shellfish industry in the Pacific Northwest as a consultant, researcher, and shellfish farmer for the last 30 years. He currently serves the Puget Sound Restoration Fund as senior scientist, having recently retired from a 20-year career with Taylor Shellfish Farms in Washington State as lead researcher to found Pacific Hybrid Incorporated, a research and development shellfish breeding company. Joth and co-investigator Betsy Peabody, also with the Puget Sound Restoration Fund, have spearheaded efforts to establish sugar kelp cultivation in Puget Sound. And this project has brought together scientists to investigate the potential for intensive seaweed aquaculture to locally modulate the carbonate chemistry of seawater passing through the kelp farm. In his spare time, Joth helps manage his family shellfish farm and is working on developing novel downstream uses of sugar kelp. Dr. Beth Wheat is a lecturer in the UW Program of the Environment with expertise in environmental studies and sustainable agriculture, or I should say sustainable studies and regenerative agriculture. A recipient of the UW Excellence in Teaching Award and a Husky Green Award, she's known as an enthusiastic and passionate educator and practitioner who leads by example, both at the UW campus farm, which she helped to establish, and on her own 20-acre integrated animal and vegetable farm on South Whidbey Island in Puget Sound. In her spare time, which she really has very little of, Elizabeth enjoys playing guitar, reading, and hanging out with her family. Finally, our third speaker, Dr. Fernando Rosende, is assistant professor in the UW School of Environmental and Forest Sciences, where he studies how to turn plant biomass into renewable biofuels using high temperature processes. He's part of the Bioresource Science and Engineering program, which led a $40 million grant from the U.S. Department of Agriculture to develop biofuels. One of his current research projects focuses on lodgepole pines that have been killed by the mountain pine beetles that are currently sweeping through the American West. I'm encouraged that someone with his expertise is interested in working with kelp as a feedstock. So now I'm ready to hand the controls over to Joth, and he will start the presentations.
Hi, and good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be part of the CCAN series, and my name is Joth Davis, and I'm going to lead this off and talk about Kelping the Sea. So the genesis of this project was established, as Meg mentioned, several years back, and I'm a principal in Hood Canal Mariculture, and as Meg mentioned, I'm lead scientist for the Peterson Restoration Fund as well. So the idea was to establish a kelp farm in, hold on a minute, I'm having a slight issue here of getting my, sorry about this, trying to get my screen back.
So Josh, what you just had looked good?
Yeah, I'm not able to control the screen.
Okay, so maybe let's try present.
Sorry.
Can you advance the arrows on the bottom?
No, it's not advancing for some odd reason. Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay, sorry. Pick it up from there. So here we go. So the idea around the Paul Allen Family Foundation question of looking at seaweed aquaculture as a possible mechanism for improving seawater chemistry, there were several key questions that we were interested in looking at, and those are as follows. Can kelp farms potentially create a refuge from ocean acidification conditions, and what is there a halo effect that might be associated with kelp that would potentially protect organisms that are living in or around the kelp farm themselves due to improved water quality conditions relative to carbonate chemistry? And I might mention that phytoremediation was a Washington State Blue Ribbon priority action to combat ocean acidification. And so getting into this whole field was very appropriate to overall strategies for the state to combat ocean acidification issues. But importantly, can growing seaweeds be scaled to potentially provide meaningful nutrient and carbon dioxide removal on a local basis? And then most importantly, I suppose, in some ways, what do we do with all that seaweed? So I'm sure that most of the CCAN audiences are familiar with this particular graphic, the famous Keeling curve measuring of carbon dioxide at the top of the weather station at Mauna Loa volcano. As you can see, increase in carbon dioxide has increased rapidly since the late 50s when it was started, the measurements were started, so that we're well above 400 parts per million today. And associated with that, of course, because the seawater is absorbing about a quarter of all the CO2 produced in the air, that's in the air. Dissolved CO2 has also gone up, and that's resulted in a shift downward of oceanic pH by about a 0.1 pH unit, which is doesn't sound like a lot, but as you all know, this is a log scale that pH is measured upon, and so 0.1 decrease is about a 30% decrease in acidity in the open ocean. And note that the open ocean station Aloha is seriously open ocean. So this is a serious and very large spread problem that extends to coastal regions where it's amplified by eutrophication that induces its own set of variables that can increase acidity of coastal waters as well. So it's a double whammy. The shellfish industry in the west coast of the United States and Canada was impacted by ocean acidification some years ago now, and it remains a major issue. So the question became some time ago, hey, can we grow kelp around our seaweed, around our shellfish to potentially help mitigate the effects of ocean acidification or eutrophication-based acidification issues? And so we went and applied to the 2013 Ocean Challenge, and I want to call out my co-PI, Betsy Peabody, and the staff of the PSRF, and my staff at Hood Canal Mariculture, that we made a major commitment to seaweed culture. So you can see the title of the proposal below, but really we were most interested on a research basis of quantifying linkages between carbonate chemistry and seaweed production, and including a very strong component of modeling for those effects. And we had added funds very recently from the United States Navy to enable the project to carry on through another year. So we wanted to establish a kelp cultivation facility, and it just so happened that I was in position to utilize a site at the north end of Hood Canal here, near Hood Head, which is this Tombollo here, to establish a kelp farm on a already permitted DNR site that would have been permitted for shellfish aquaculture. And here is an overhead of that 5-acre site. It's about 250 feet on the perimeter and 1,000 feet long moorings at both the south and the north ends. And in the middle is a 1-hectare area dedicated to kelp aquaculture. And what we did was we established a perimeter line of buoys on both sides, here and here, to enable basically boat traffic to keep out of the kelp farm. And the kelp lines were then established within this footprint. It's about 1 hectare area total, and numerous kelp grow-out lines, which I'll get into in a moment, but they're all suspended at about a 3-meter depth. And we were very interested, here's just a view of the cultivation lines. We were very interested in then seeding those lines out with sugar kelp to then have it grow out and do some research, and I'll get into that later. But the main focus of this talk is to really talk about how did we go about establishing a kelp farm. Well, we didn't know a whole lot about the potential utilization of this site for kelp. One of the most important parameters, if you're thinking about establishing a kelp farm, you've got to make sure that dissolved nitrogen and phosphorus is going to be in enough abundance at your site to enable you to actually grow seaweed. That's critical. So we needed to establish some basic parameters around flow rate, both direction and velocity. And so what you have here is a tidal graph, and we did some measurements using window shade drogues that correspond to about mid-outgoing tide. And we put drogues in the water. This is the south end of the lease here, and we just simply recovered them up 10 to 20 minutes later up to the north. And what we found, this is a footprint of the farm itself, and what we found was the current does more or less run through the farm, slightly oblique to the perimeter of the farm, or the longitudinal axis of the farm, but good enough for what we wanted to do. So most of the time on the outgoing tide, the currents flow from essentially southwest to northeast, which is just perfect for what we're trying to do out there. So whenever one wants to consider even consider doing any kind of aquaculture in Washington State, or really any state in the United States, and seaweed aquaculture in particular, requires a real deep dive into permitting. So I want to go through those steps. As I said earlier, we were very lucky to actually have a permitted site for shellfish. So we had to go back, and we rewrote our lease agreement with the Washington Department of Natural Resources so that we could then cover seaweed aquaculture combined with shellfish. This required going back to our local county, Jefferson County in this case, to review our SEPA and other permits that we were interested in making some changes to it. If you're getting into it for the very first time, you have to pay attention to shoreline development permits, which are probably is really the entry level and probably the most difficult permit to get, at least in Washington State, with respect to trying to start an aquaculture farm. That said, it just takes time and perseverance. And I recommend you have both before you get going too deeply into your overall other parts of your project. We also, in our case, checked for compliance with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Department of Ecology, and the Department of Health, because it was an existing shellfish farm. But our real negotiations were with the Seattle District of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And in this particular case, we agreed to release our lease from the nationwide 48 permit, which pertains precisely and only to shellfish, in order to be able to develop an individual permit to conduct what the Army Corps refers to as mariculture. And in their definitions, mariculture included seaweed. So we had to basically give up our nationwide permit to take on an individual permit. And then most importantly, or as importantly, we work with the local Washington tribes whose UNA areas include this particular footprint of a farm, and we worked closely with them for their support, and we also worked with local Washington non-governmental organizations for their support of the project. And I will say that both support from both the tribes and NGOs is super important as well for establishing rapport and the basis for good relationships moving forward. And then we made initial contacts finally with the Washington State Department of Agriculture for the beginning of permitting for HACCP development for seaweed harvest and processing. So this was important. And then in the pictures below, you can just see some of the first kelp harvest, which I'll be getting into in a bit. So steps, let's build a sugar kelp farm. What did we do? Well, the very first thing was we had to establish a mooring system to withstand expected drag from tidal wind-driven currents. We needed information in storm wind direction, maximum fetch, wave height, and period, just to make sure that the actual mooring system can withstand what's needed to put out a lot of kelp in a relatively small volume, because the drag forces are very, very significant. We next installed a lattice and flotation system to support the culture system itself. We put in grow lines just prior to seeding them with very small kelp plants, which I'll get into in a moment. We then planted out those small plants, or called sporophytes, that were seeded on a twine that we wound around the grow lines, which again you'll see in a moment. And then in our case, we were in any farmer's case, if you want to monitor early survivorship and growth of the kelp, because that's basically why you're doing this. And then we started advanced planning for HACCP harvest, processing, and most importantly, marketing. We were very interested in monitoring biofouling, because the kelp plants need to be clean to be able to be harvested for human consumption, and that was something that we were very focused on as well. And then I would recommend and follow a good manual for all of the above. And in this particular case, we used the manual that was produced through a kelp farm development project in the state of Maine called Ocean Approved. Highly recommend this particular manual. It's full of pictures and lots of reference material for the step-by-step beginning kelp farmers, and this was very valuable to us. So here's a short video of outplanting or putting out the actual grow lines, and you'll just see a short clip here that that's done. They just wound off the boat and into the water, suspended at about a 3-meter depth. And then I want to mention in a couple minutes the interesting life history of kelps on how they are actually produced in the laboratory. The adult, what you look at if you go to the beach or see kelp, you're actually looking at the sporophyte, or it's the part of the plant that produces the reproductive body, or sorus. Within the sorus are microscopic zoospores, and these can be induced to be shed into a beaker, for example, here or somewhere into the water column under natural conditions. They produce male and female gametophytes that then join together to produce essentially a new sporophyte plant. And so most of that happens, in our case, in the laboratory. And so in this photograph here is a piece of PVC pipe 3 inches in diameter and 3 inches in diameter, about a foot tall, wound very tightly with kite string And on the kite string, these very small gametophyte formations are made, and the very small sporophyte then results from that and grows. And here's a photograph of very small sporophytes just prior to bringing out into the environment where they'll be planted. So here's the group moving these tubes with the sporophytes wound on kite string from the laboratory. We've transported in seawater onto the boat, put them into another tote full of seawater, out to the farm. And here we are on the farm. And here's a short clip of seeding the kelp. Now what you're going to see is the tube here with the twine winding off the tube around and around onto the grow line here. So here we go. So you can see the seeded twine being wound out onto the grow line, and that's essentially what we do for each of the lines, and very straightforward. So the next few pictures are just really some depictions of what the underwater scene looks like. Again, we established the kelp lines, the grow lines, at 3 meters depth. They're moored with weights below and buoys above. And here's just a visual of what it might look like. This is the wound on sporophytes on twine onto the main grow line. And then after a few weeks, you'll see a little bit of kelp growing on the grow lines. This is typically late winter. We like to establish the actual seeded kelp sometime before the winter solstice. So really, right, in 2018 or 17, we established the kelp in mid-December. We were a little later this year, but I'd rather go back to early December. That's much more amenable, I think, to the overall program. And so as things grow, there's just a depiction of growing sugar kelp. Now, the idea here, of course, is during the grow-out phase, the kelp is taking up carbon dioxide during the daytime to fuel up growth, along with nitrogen and phosphorus, other nutrients. There's likely to be loss of carbon dioxide at night when the kelp respires, but the notion here is providing habitat and for a host of invertebrates and fishes. And prior to harvest, at least, this potentially provides great habitat for a host of organisms. Here's kelp grow out. This is Stephen Schreck, one of our PSRF folks, who's just done an enormous amount of work on the farm, along with Brian Allen, his compatriot. And this is kelp about a month old, and I can assure you that today I was in the lab this morning, and it's a lot bigger. So things are going well. Here's a short clip of what the kelp looks like underwater. So swimming along, looking good. This is pretty young still. It's going to be it can be up to 3 meters long at the end of the grow out, and which brings me to grow out. We monitored a variety of different production metrics in last year, and we're doing the same thing this year. But the bottom line is, look at the blue graphic, the blue bars here. It's actually giving you total production in terms of milligrams of carbon per day taken up by kelp. The other parts of the graphic relate to the net production, which is really growth per day, and production loss to dissolved organic material, because the kelp itself sloughs material all the time. And of course, it then also erodes. Eventually, the whole plant will erode away. But during the time we were measuring it, you can see that erosion comprises a relatively small component of the kelp production, but that's subsequently lost. So in our case, we were looking forward very, very much to harvest day. Now, I mentioned the Ocean Challenge, and one of the things we have done during these past 2 years is establish the farm, but we also worked with Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory and the University of Washington to place 2 oceanographic buoys, one upstream and one essentially downstream of the kelp farm itself. So as you can see, here's the more or less upstream buoy and the downstream buoy. And we're working with, so that the prevailing current, of course, is, and again, that's, we do see reverse flow from north to south, but actually most of the time, because of the gyres associated in that part of Hood Canal, we see a prevailing tidal current of south to north slightly oblique to the longitudinal axis of the kelp farm itself. I want to mention, I'm not going to go through any of the results that have been obtained to date through this work, but as I mentioned at the beginning, we're very interested in assessing changes in the chemistry and hydrographic parameters of the seawater passing through the kelp biomass. And we're measuring on either a discrete or semi or continuous basis, PCO2, pH, dissolved organic carbon, dissolved inorganic carbon, total alkalinity, DO, and salinity over the grow-out season of kelp. And project partners here are Jan Newton and John Mickett at UW and Applied Physics Lab, and Dick Feely and Simone Aline at NOAA PMEL. Michael Horworth is working with us very closely with pH measurements, and he's with the Washington Department of Natural Resources. There's also a very significant modeling component where Dale Kiefer and Zach Seacrest of SSA, Dale's actually at the University of Southern California. We're looking at nutrient flux versus uptake, and then of course net total production on the effects of carbonic chemistry. The notion here is just a simple model telling you kind of where the different components of growth might go and impact carbon as it passes through the system. And so the idea, of course, with the model is to hopefully apply what we see here in other parts of the world where sugar kelp is grown with information on flux of current and nutrients. It should hopefully be able to be somewhat predictive. We're also doing biological studies to assess that halo effect that I got into at the beginning. We're working here with actually the world's expert with marine pteropods. These critters here, they have an aragonite shell that actually she has shown that in the open ocean they dissolve, and with ocean acidic conditions that we currently have. And along with her, we're doing some mesocosm studies coming up very soon, along with habitat use studies by fish and other invertebrates. We're also with NOAA working with hydrophones that will be implanted on the kelp farm and hopefully detect salmon that have been implanted with acoustic tags that we might be able to map their passage or utilization of the kelp farm. So that's pretty exciting. So to get back to sort of the original parameters, seaweed, aquaculture, and carbon removal, these are all the things we're most interested in looking at, and it's like the same sets of questions, and we're right in the middle of looking at all of those issues now. And downstream use, because at the end of the day, what do we do with all that seaweed? Well, I'm going to pass the baton here in a moment, but the opportunities are endless. Our original proposal with the Allen Foundation was looking at food, compost, bioenergy components. What I found is that actually there's an enormous variety of products that are actually being looked at with the potential of using sugar kelp. So now we've got gin on the horizon, and then even on Valentine's Day, there are kelp-based goodies that are able to be produced. So along with the kelp noodle, and sky's the limit as far as the food components are involved, and it's a brand new set of products that I'm super excited about. So I think we are seeing really only the very beginning, the tip of the iceberg, if you will, of seaweed utilization here in North America, and I believe there's an enormous potential, and I think I'll leave it here. This is the kelp team, and I'll give up my screen and hand it back to Meg. But thank you very, very much for the opportunity, and I hope to take questions towards the end. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Joth. You can just leave that screen up there. I like that people can look at the diverse project partners, and I think there may even be more of them. But you did get some questions during your presentation. Brittany Hanish is curious what the average depth of the kelp farm site on Hood Canal is, and then why you chose a 3-meter depth for the kelp longlines.
Yes. Well, the average depth at the kelp farm is actually fairly deep. At the shallow end, it's about 40 feet at mean low water. At the deep end, it's about 70 feet at mean low water. And the second question, you'll have to remind me, Meg, what was it?
I was on mute. Why did you choose a 3-meter depth for the kelp longlines?
Yes.
And go ahead.
Good question. Yes, 3 meters depth, of course. Well, that's essentially the depth that was chosen based on anticipated light levels. We actually found that 3 meters is a little deep when there's phytoplankton bloom in Hood Canal, and as we get into this more deeply, we will be we have the capacity on the farm to raise the level of the kelp lines up to, well, really we could bring them up to just below the surface if we wanted to, but 3 meters was a good depth in the winter because clarity and transparency is high. Though I will say that it does decrease significantly during the spring bloom, and I think in the future we would be bringing up the depth of the kelp plants themselves to 2 meters and maybe even 1 meter, depending on, again, on water transparency. But it's all about light levels and being optimal for growing kelp, in the sea.
Okay, well, we have some other questions, and I certainly have a long list, but I want to give our two subsequent presenters enough time for their shows, and then we'll come back to questions for all three. So at this point, I'd like to hand the presentation over to Beth Wheat, and her screen is already up. Look, that's great. So I think Beth is ready to go. I'll go back on mute.
Hello, my name is Beth, and I am hoping that you can see my presentation. Can you see my screen?
So we're not.
I can see it.
Be able to see it, but something happened right when you took over controls to speak. Maybe click to exit full screen. Maybe just try clicking.
Okay, great. Can you see that now?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead to presentation again?
All right. Yeah, so my name's Beth Wheat, and I have a really interesting interaction with the work that Joth has been doing. I actually went to graduate school and studied marine ecology and worked kind of in a parallel world with Joth down in Willapa Bay doing research on growing oysters. But when I graduated the University of Washington, I started considering what I really wanted to do with my life and got involved in the environmental studies department at UW and ended up becoming a farmer, which is not unsurprising considering that I grew up in rural America in an agricultural community on a small family farm. And so I've moved to the south end of Whidbey Island, and here on Whidbey, I'm a faculty member at the University of Washington in the environmental studies program, and I operate a small-scale farm. And so I wanted to start just taking us back a step from the work that Joth has been doing and talk a little bit about how farms interact with the carbon cycle. And so farms are really important interactors in the global carbon cycle. I think farms are responsible for producing, agriculture is responsible for producing about 11% of our annual greenhouse gas emissions. And so we're playing an important role in kind of loading the atmosphere with extra carbon. And of course, as Joth was talking about, that extra carbon is ending up in the ocean and causing ocean acidification. So farms are interacting with the carbon cycle in a lot of different ways. And one way is that we bring carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere whenever we're growing plants, and they're doing photosynthesis, and they're bringing in carbon dioxide and turning that into plant biomass. And as much as we can on a farm, as much as we can bring the plant biomass down and get it stored in the soil, we're actually helping be part of the solution to climate change as opposed to being a contributor of carbon. So anything that we can do to increase rates of photosynthesis and eventually rates of stored carbon in our soil is really good for helping reduce our impact as a greenhouse gas contributor. So in farming and in places where agricultural soils have been diminished in a big way, like this picture in Ireland, farms have a long history of actually going to the ocean and collecting plant matter and biomass from the ocean and bringing that up to fertilize their fields and create growing conditions that help plants do astonishingly well. Most commercial fertilizers that you buy in the store actually have some amount of kelp meal in them because kelp contains a lot of essential micronutrients to promote plant health. And you can read more about this. There's all sorts of great histories and movies about the work that historically farmers have done, bringing the productivity of the ocean back up and onto land. And so here's a picture of Joss Kelp Farm out in the northern part of the Hood Canal. And one of the really exciting things is that Joss Kelp Farm is only a few miles away by boat from my farm on South Whidbey Island. And so one day, gosh, I guess about a year ago now, I was in the office and I overheard Meg discussing about how they were going to have this harvest of kelp and they weren't sure what they were going to do with this incredible amount of biomass. And, you know, on our farm on South Whidbey Island, we're constantly thinking about how we can be doing the work of building soil fertility and sequestering carbon in our soils to help combat climate change. So it seemed to us like, wow, this is a win-win situation. And so we said yes to the universe, and then astonishingly, everything worked out. We were able to work with Josh. Josh got a barge and loaded the kelp up into these totes. And there was a man with a big truck, and he was able to help us get these totes into the truck. And we took 2 separate trips, and I guess it was close to 14 or 15,000 pounds of wet kelp got brought off to our farm. And this is a picture of the work of unloading that kelp. So we got the kelp delivered. We got it here on the farm, and it turned out that shortly after the kelp arrived, I had a group of students from the University of Washington in a class that is studying agricultural ecosystems. And they came out to the farm and they worked with me, and we set up this big trial ground where we were asking the question of how can we take the micronutrients that are in this kelp and take the biomass and the carbon that's in this kelp and sequester it in the soil. And so we had a series of different treatments. We set out small 1 meter by 1 meter plots. We covered some plots with black tarps to try to help just reduce the respiration of the decomposition, to reduce oxygen flow, and just see if that would help the kelp biomass get deeper into the ground. We also had this white covering here, which is it's called Remay, and it allows about 80% of the light in, and it has lots of air exchange between the 2 sides, but it was a different type of covering. So we did that, and then we had kelp that was just set out in plots where it was bare kelp open to the vagaries of birds and whatever else would come in there. And then, of course, we had several plots that were just 1 meter by 1 meter with nothing put down on them. And the really interesting thing was that within about a month of setting the kelp out, the plots that didn't have any covering on them, you could hardly see where the kelp was at all because the grass had actually started growing so fast that it grew right up through and it seemed to actually just consume the kelp itself. The other types of plots are still out there, and this summer my class will be returning, and we're going to take soil samples, and we'll be testing those soil samples to learn about how the addition of the kelp changed the carbon or the stored organic matter in the soils. And we're hoping to get some funding to be able to look at how the signatures, the isotopic signatures of soil and soil organisms may be changing because of the addition of the kelp. So we'll also when we take those soil samples, we'll also get some information back on the different nutrients that are in the soil and maybe how the soil nutrients have changed with the application of the kelp. So we have this kind of fun ongoing research project, and then there were some kelp left over that didn't go into the experimental setup, and that kelp we took and put into big compost piles, and we composted it, and we just got our certification, so we've been putting that compost, our organic certification, we've been putting that compost out on our fields. So we're really excited about the possibility of the kelp as it gets too big and can no longer be as a food source, the possibility of using kelp to help sequester carbon in the soils. And one way kelp might do that is that kelp might actually act as sort of a fertilizer that would help stimulate plant growth. And this is an image that's actually taken from grasses that grow in the prairie. And you can see here, these prairie grasses get to be really deep-rooted grasses. So they're going down almost 3 meters deep in the soil. And so that's an epic amount of growth. And these grasses are perennial grasses. Their roots don't get disturbed every year. They just keep growing year after year. And if you look through these slides here in September and December, in December, there was another grass planted, an annual grass, and the annual grass grew just a little bit. In March, it grew a little bit more. In June, the annual grass achieved its maximum growth rate. And at that time also, the perennial grass was achieving its maximum growth rate. And you can see how much root biomass is underground when the perennial grass is at its height of growth. And that's really interesting. So one thing that kelp may be doing on our pasture in the field that you saw is the kelp may actually be stimulating root growth in our plants and helping our plants. They're never going to have root systems like these prairie grasses, but our perennial pastures can sequester carbon by allocating resources to their root growth, and the kelp may be part of stimulating that. So we're really excited to see how that may happen. So one of the big things that the kelp can do, and part of the work that our farm is excited about, is how kelp can be part of adding organic matter to the soil. And organic matter is just any plant material or stored carbon. And so this slide is just to remind me to say that basically when you're a farmer, the more organic matter you can get into your fields, the healthier your plants become. It's a complex slide with lots of different ways that organic matter helps increase plant health, but basically organic matter is at the base of the soil food web, and it's the thing that stimulates healthy plant growth. So we're all about doing the work that we can do here on the farm to help build an agricultural system that regenerates productivity in the landscape. We practice conservation tillage, we practice crop rotation. We have short-term pasture rotations with animals to increase our pasture biomass. We produce compost. We add kelp. We do kelp experiments. And we're working on a lot of on-farm habitat restoration to improve our on-site water capture and retention rates in the farm. These are all things that help us be good land stewards, and working in partnership with the kelp and aquaculture community is an amazing partnership, right? Because as a farm being this close to the ocean, the ways in which we can help the watershed of our farm store the nutrition of our farm on the farm and not let the nutrients from our farm run off into the watershed, that's really important. So the on-farm habitat restoration is a critical piece for us. So yeah, so this is a picture of our farm, and here's some of the work we're doing, our fields, pasture systems. The kelp project is actually right back here. You can see where that dark green is. I think that's about where that kelp got put. That's about the center of our kelp research project. And then these are our vegetable fields and our pastures over here, back here, and then up here. So some pictures of our habitat restoration, pasture management, and the incorporation of animals and cover crops. And these are the beginning of swales to help hold that water onto the farm, planting them up with trees. So we've got a big orchard project happening here, and continuing this work of soil building. And the kelp is this really important element of helping build a healthy soil in a farm ecosystem, which can lend us to growing more perennial crops that do a better job of storing carbon than annual crops do. But annual crops are still an important element of our system, and here they are. We're also working a lot with trying to reduce the amount that we disturb our soil in order to keep that carbon in the soil as long as possible. So those are some of the ways that I feel like our farm is working to be part of a carbon solution. And one of the really cool synergies with the work of kelp farming to basically really get at this problem in a holistic vision for how we can utilize the biomass of the kelp and get that carbon out of the ocean and get it stored into our soils. And with that, I think I'll take some questions, or we'll hand it off to our next presenter.
Thank you so much, Beth. The first question, inspired by your presentation, is one that I bet you get frequently. And Francesca Perez is wondering whether you used fresh water to rinse the kelp, I assume as before it was applied to your pasture.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did a little research on this when I was in graduate school. We also had a small garden in graduate school, and we applied a lot of kelp to our garden there. And what we found was that because of the amount of rain that we get in the winter season, most of those salts just wash away. So we haven't had any problem with sort of the accumulation of salts in and around the plots where we've been growing the kelp. And in fact, on those research plots now, I should have taken a picture, but the grass that's growing in those plots where kelp was applied, you can actually see the square of the dark color of that grass looking healthier, looking stronger and more robust than the grass adjacent to it. That's a great question.
Thank you. I can see that Fernando is all queued up to give his 10-minute presentation, and I just want to let everyone know that we're going to just go past 2 o'clock. We can do that. If you can stay with us, great. If you have to leave the broadcast, do come back to the CCAN webinar site. This presentation will be archived, and so you'll be able to hear any questions that we fielded at the end that you weren't able to stay for. So, Fernando, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. So, this is Fernando Resende, and I'm going to be talking about one of the specific applications for kelp that I have started becoming involved recently, which is the potential biofuels production. And first thing, before entering the details on why we want to use kelp, why is it important that we make biofuels? First of all, because it is biofuels that they come from a renewable resource. You can always, as you use fuels from biomass, you can always obtain more. It is also a possibility of obtaining fuels which are carbon neutral, and the concept is illustrated here on the right on the figure. If let's say you somehow are able to get the transportation fuels for your car from biofuels, if they are biofuels, then you're going to release carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. However, the plant recaptures that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere during the photosynthesis process, and basically the idea is that if you're using a biofuel, you're basically just promoting a cycle here for the carbon without increasing the net amount of CO2. There is also large availability of feedstocks for biofuels in most places in the world, and of course there is also the economic motivation. You want to have alternatives in case of oil price fluctuations. So more specific now about kelp. What triggered our interest in using kelp as a feedstock for producing biofuels? And the answer to this is that the kelp itself addresses many of the current issues that we have today, and the challenges that the biofuels industry faces today. They are addressed by the use of kelp. One of them being that it does not require land. In addition, kelp is a halophyte, meaning that it does not require fresh water. That's another huge issue that prevents the development of the biofuels industry. So the need for land, the need for fresh water to grow feedstock. Kelp also does not require fertilizers, pesticides, and it's one of the world's fastest growing plants. Some kelps can grow up to half a meter per day, reaching 30 to 80 meters. So it's a lot of feedstock that can be grown in a fairly short amount of time. And you have the possibility then harvesting and collection being a benefit for U.S. coastal communities. Now, that leads to the question, has anybody tried to use kelp for biofuels yet, or is this new? There have been attempts, and most of those attempts were to convert the kelp to ethanol. And the problem, the main issue associated, the main barrier associated with producing the ethanol from kelp is that there is a huge dewatering effort that is required, because kelp is going to have at least 60 to 70% moisture, often more than that. So you need to be able to remove a significant amount of the mass in the form of water before even start thinking about doing that conversion process to biofuels. So that's one of the problems in using kelp. So our contribution here is to take an alternative approach to convert kelp into biofuels, in which we are not trying to remove the water, but actually we're trying to use the water for our own benefit here. So rather than dewatering, we're going to use the water as a solvent. And the process that we are proposing to do this is called hydrothermal liquefaction. I'm going to explain what this is. So the idea basically is that you have water, and we all know that at atmospheric pressure, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. However, if you increase the pressure, it's possible to have liquid water at temperatures much higher than 100 degrees C, and that's what is shown here on the left side of the slide on the figure. That if you increase a pressure, you can go to temperatures as high as 300 degrees C and still have hot compressed water. That is what we use for hydrothermal liquefaction. The medium is hot compressed water, so there is a need for water in this specific process, and the fact that kelp has so much moisture makes it an excellent fit for a process like that. So typically, hydrothermal liquefaction consists in putting kelp, mixing the kelp with water, and then taking the entire system to 200 to 300 degrees Celsius and pressure of 10 to 20 megapascal. So it's a complex chemical process that takes place because of the complex structure of the macroalgae. However, in very general terms here, we can think of the macroalgae as being a large molecule, and a hydrolysis process takes place in the sense that the water molecules come in and interact. The water basically attacks the large, long macroalgae molecule, breaking it down into several smaller components. And then those components, once they are liberated, they can further react into different additional molecules. So you have a hydrolysis process that takes place because of the excess water that is interacting with the macroalgae, and then you have additional reactions that take place because of the high temperature. There is a large mixture of compounds that can be produced in a process like that, hydrothermal liquefaction. Now the question is, what exactly are we trying to do here? What are our target products? And the goal of our project here, we are just starting this, but what we are planning in our targets is liquid hydrocarbons for transportation fuels. And you see in the slides the chemical representations for some of the molecules that could potentially be produced: benzene, toluene, and p-xylene are some of them. They are collectively known as BTX, and they can be used as solvents, but more often they are used as additives for gasoline. And in addition to that, we have cycloalkanes like cyclohexane and alkane molecules, which are, especially the cycloalkanes or naphthenes, they're components of jet fuel. So there is a good potential. So the products that we are trying to make here, they could be very interesting for the aviation industry as well. Now, the challenge in getting from macroalgae, from kelp, into hydrocarbons is that the algae is composed of carbohydrates. So there's going to be a significant amount of oxygen atoms already to begin with. But the idea of hydrothermal liquefaction, if you look here at the bottom right of the screen, is that the water tends to dissociate. So we look at the chemical reaction, the water breaks down, producing H+ and OH-. So there is a large availability, and that's what the picture here on the left shows, the increase in the ionization constant for this reaction. Basically, it's just stating this reaction takes place quite a bit, providing a lot of hydrogen atoms, which could replace those oxygen atoms and therefore generate hydrocarbons during this hydrothermal liquefaction process. Now, the experimental setup for this would be fairly simple, and we have two types of chemical reactors in which this transformation could take place. Here, what we named A is a metallic reactor made of Swagelok parts. There is also the possibility of doing this hydrothermal liquefaction process inside quartz reactors. So these are very simple and straightforward ways to carry out this process. So the idea is that we load the kelp and any additional water, and then we seal those reactors and immerse those reactors inside a fluidized sand bath, which is essentially just working as an oven, a device that helps us reach the temperature that is desired. Could be 300, 400 degrees C, and the fact that these reactors, they are a closed volume, the water will expand and automatically generate the pressure required. Okay, so we just started working with this, but we have a few preliminary results in which we try to vary the catalyst that was placed alongside with the kelp and water, and what the figure is showing here is essentially a measure of the yield. How many hydrocarbons were we able to produce? So even though this is very preliminary still, so we can compare what we obtain in terms of hydrocarbons with no catalyst placed what happens when we start mixing this the kelp with these catalytic materials. And what we observe is that depending on the catalyst that we get, we can essentially promote the formation of hydrocarbons by 1 order of magnitude. So the idea here, or the bottom line, is that the catalyst is the key for this transformation process. We are going to be using this catalyst in an attempt to get the highest possible use of hydrocarbons, the products that we talked about. So in summary here, the use of kelp addresses several of the current issues with the biofuels production itself. And what we are proposing, the hydrothermal liquefaction process, which we are trying to get some funding now to really get this process going, that will take advantage of the water and the properties of the water that is already coming with the kelp to generate those liquid transportation fuels. So that's essentially it from me, and I guess now we go back to Meg.
Thank you, Fernando. That was perfect timing and a great presentation. I'm going to direct a few questions specifically to Fernando, and then actually now I have to do 2 things at once. I'm going to put myself back on presenter, show my screen. Okay, everyone can digest this slide while we're having our question and answer session for about the next 10 minutes. We will need to wrap up at about 15 after. But the first thing I want to say about Fernando's presentation is there is major interest in the development of biofuels from kelp and seaweed coming from the federal level. Recently, the Department of Energy has funded to the tune of millions of dollars a number of pilot projects around the country through its ARPA-E program to explore the potential of kelps and biofuels. So Fernando and his lab are really on the cutting edge of a new field, and I'm very optimistic that this industry will grow. Specific question for Fernando, and this comes from me, but perhaps, oh no, now there's a whole bunch. I'll just be quick with my question. How long does it take you in your trial runs to convert a batch of wet kelp into hydrocarbons?
The time, so if it's a batch, the time would be a variable. We could do as early as about 2.5 minutes. If there is interest in allowing the reactions to take place for a longer period of time, we could leave it for 1 hour or even more. So there is a large variation in time from minutes to actually 1 hour. But in the lab, this would be done in batch systems. But eventually, what we all would like to see is a continuous system that in which the kelp would be fed at a certain rate, and there would be continuous production of hydrocarbons from the kelp that is fed in this process. So that would be the ultimate goal here. But what we have in the lab at this point, we are talking about a few minutes to 1 hour.
Okay, so pretty quickly. And what your answer actually segues really well into a question we just received from Tom Mumford. He wanted to know if the catalysts used in the biomass processing suffer from poisoning, for example, sulfur poisoning. So if you were trying to have a continuous feed process, I assume your catalyst would need to be up to the job. Can you speak to Tom's question?
That is a possibility. Now, it would all depend primarily on the specific composition of the kelp that we are using and of the specific catalyst. Some catalysts are not susceptible to sulfur poisoning. Other catalysts are very sensitive to sulfur, and not only that, there are other components that can affect the performance of the catalyst. Typically, the main problem is coking, the formation of large carbon residues on the surface of the catalyst. So this is all, I would say at this point, it's a problem that exists, but there are ways in which those issues can be addressed, either by using specific conditions that remove. There are conditions in which some of those components, let's say coke, can be removed from the catalyst surface, or by using a catalyst that is more tolerant to impurities in the feed, or in some cases you may just have to go through a regeneration process. And I wish I had a better response at this point, but our catalytic work has just started. So I'm all talking in terms of possibilities here. There is the possibility of poisoning, but we have already plans if this happens to be the case of approaches that we can use to try to minimize that.
Thank you. That's a really thorough answer. And we had another question from Brian DeLay. If you can quickly answer this one, I think it's probably on many people's minds. Brian is wondering if excess salt is a concern for hydrothermal liquefaction.
The excess salt.
Yeah, so salt with the sea coming in with the kelp.
No, we don't anticipate that the salt would be a problem here. What the salt would more likely just remain dissolved in the water, and then just being separated from the hydrocarbons. So after we do the hydrothermal liquefaction process, we would have to bring that water back to room temperature, and that would automatically separate an aqueous phase and an organic phase, and the salts would remain in the aqueous phase. So as far as I can tell, and from the knowledge that I have, that other people that have worked with hydrothermal liquefaction as well, we don't anticipate a lot of problems because of the salt. There are other issues, but I don't think the salt would be one of them.
Okay, thank you. And apparently salt is not a problem for application to pasture land either. I'm going to switch back to questions for Joth. We're getting quite a few of those. In fact, I can kind of bundle a few. Imagine I am a new aquaculturist interested in getting into the kelp aquaculture field. Joth, as part of this privately funded project that involves a huge team of scientists, you've had, the project has benefited from a lot of expertise in modeling and the ability to monitor seawater chemistry and understand the currents and the other things that are important to site selection. If you are not part of a large scientific team, what are the resources that might be available? I hope, and Joth, if you don't know the answer, that's okay. But where would you recommend someone interested in kelp aquaculture turn to help evaluate sites, potential sites? Way ahead of the permitting process, just trying to understand what might be good from an oceanographic perspective and how could they maybe conduct some of the most essential monitoring or and understand what the salinity is of the site. That's another question that came in.
Great questions. So to address those, there are actually some good resources produced through the Department of Ecology, the Department of Natural Resources, and other agencies. There are county atlases that, for example, that give you information about wave fetch at a proposed site, for example. There's lots of information with the National Weather Service to give you good information on wind direction and maximal wind direction, storm potential. At the end of the day, you're going to want to make sure that your farm basically can withstand the elements, by that mainly wind-driven currents and waves, but also be in a place that can receive nutrient-rich seawater to actually enable the kelp to grow. And that information, actually, there's information with the Department of Ecology on water quality sampling that include nutrients. So that would be helpful to look at. Site selection is tricky. You do want to have good information about the flux of nutrients through the farm, and some information on wave and other types of weather that might impact your particular site. Great question. I think at the end of the day, it's going to be very useful to talk to other people, other aquaculturists who have been in that very same position, trying to figure out, yeah, if I site this here, what's going to happen? And I think that's find people with experience, and they will, I'm sure, be helpful as well. But there are online resources available through our state agencies. Hello?
Yeah, so it looks like we've lost.
Oh, sorry.
Audio.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jellen. I was on mute.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, what I was trying to say is we are at the end of our time pretty much, and we have a long list of really terrific questions. So I want people to know that we're going to share the questions with the speakers. In every case, whether you've designated it or not, it's quite obvious who you'd like to ask. So you may get an answer from the speaker over email. And I hope that everybody takes advantage of this great team of experts here, because they really know a lot. We have maybe time for one more question, and it's one I haven't even considered before, and it can go to Joth, I think, but Beth may want to weigh in on this also, because it's kind of agricultural. Carl Owen is first wondering if there are any major diseases that kelp farmers should worry about. And Carl, our answer may come to you in the context of Puget Sound. I don't know where you are living. And he also wonders if it would be beneficial to a kelp farm to border the fields with different species of kelp that would not be harvested, much in the way that some terrestrial farmers leave a stipe or strip of native grasses between fields. Mm-hmm. Interesting question.
Good question. On the diseases, I'm not aware of any, though I will say that kelps can take up heavy metals, and so that's something to at least consider. I know that arsenic is one mineral that's taken up in very small quantities by seaweeds, so that's something to look at. And as far as the buffer thought, what's important to recognize that the kelp is actually going to grow and then it's going to degrade in the same year. So it's an annual in that sense. And so all the nutrients that are sequestered into the plant tissues will eventually be lost unless it's harvested out of the system, which is fine. That's what happens in the natural world with wild kelp fields, of course. But if you're trying to sequester nutrients and, for example, put them in Beth Weed's farm, you would want, and so therefore the nutrients get potentially locked up in the soils, you would want to harvest that kelp at maximal biomass. So, but the other point is that, yeah, a buffer of seaweeds will also provide terrific habitat for a whole host of critters, and so including fish and mobile invertebrates. So it's a good idea, and but again, it's an annual, and so it will eventually die back.
Okay, thank you very much. My screen is up. I'm just going to, nope, there we are. We're going to wrap it up here. I hope many of you get your questions answered over email. I just want to call your attention to next month's roundtable discussion. It will be Wednesday, June 20th, same time, 1 p.m. And it's going to be a really interesting roundup of the lessons that we've learned here in the state of Washington through our role as a leader, really, in developing and addressing ocean acidification at the management and science levels. And you're going to hear from some of the people who have really led that effort. It's a big team. Martha Kongsgaard, who chairs the Marine Resource Advisory Council here in Washington State, which has been charged with carrying forth the recommendations of the Washington Blue Ribbon Panel on Ocean Acidification. So she's been with this effort for a long, long time. And then many people who have also worked closely in the state process to understand and address ocean acidification. So I really hope you will tune in. I apologize for not changing the color of the URL. If you can't see it, just go straight to the California Current Acidification Network website, and you will see a link to this upcoming presentation as well as instructions to register. Thank you all for joining us today. We welcome any feedback, and you can share that feedback with Terry King, whose email is wsgcanal@uw.edu. All right, till next month.